Welcome to the Archetype Project. Today we are going to discover the Saul Complex, a phenomenon that explains why some successful leaders end up sabotaging their own legacy. Through the figure of the first king of Israel, we explore the paradox of the insecure leader. How is it possible for a capable person chosen for success to become their own enemy? We will see how the transition from initial humility to constant suspicion defines a profound psychological downfall. This archetype is not just an ancient story. It is a mirror of the lack of emotional regulation in power today. We will analyze why the fear of replacement can dismantle even the most brilliant career. Without further delay, we begin. Imagine the day of your greatest recognition. Saul, instead of being at the front, was hidden among the baggage. Many see this as a show of pure humility. However, from a psychological perspective, this behavior suggests something more complex: avoidant resistance. We must ask, is it real modesty or fear of judgment? This initial shyness can be a mask for a fragile ego. By hiding, Saul was trying to protect himself from the weight of others' expectations. If they don't see you, they can't judge you. The problem arises when that person suddenly receives absolute power. The transition from private citizen to public monarch was too abrupt. Saul did not choose the throne. The throne chose him. This lack of personal agency sowed the first seeds of his insecurity. When someone feels inadequate for their position, any criticism is perceived as a mortal threat. This humble shadow was not a virtue, but a defense mechanism. The leader who begins by fleeing from responsibility usually ends up obsessed with retaining it. Thus, the fear of failure becomes, little by little, a destructive paranoia. Imagine you are in Gilgal, waiting for an order that does not arrive. Saul finds himself in this exact situation while his army begins to desert out of fear. At this critical point, his insecurity takes control of his decisions. Instead of staying calm, he feels that his authority disappears if he does not retain his people at any cost. This is where the trap of approval arises. Saul decides to perform the ritual sacrifice himself, usurping a function that did not belong to him. He does not act out of malice, but out of a reactive impulsivity, so as not to lose the favor of his followers. For a leader with this profile, external perception is always more urgent than the integrity of the process. When his mentor, Samuel, arrives and confronts him, Saul justifies his mistake by blaming the circumstances. This is the first real crack in his character. By prioritizing social validation over long-term strategy, he demonstrates that his leadership is fragile. What seems like an act of urgency is, in reality, the beginning of a paranoia that will consume him completely. The arrival of new talent can be the greatest blessing for a team or the worst nightmare for a fragile leader. When David appears on the scene and achieves military success, Saul's perception changes drastically. Instead of seeing a valuable ally, he begins to see a mirror reflecting his own shortcomings. Then arises the shadow of comparison. This is a bias where the brilliance of others is interpreted as a loss of one's own light. Why does the success of a subordinate generate so much fear? For Saul, the chants of the people praising David more were the trigger for his downfall. This is the anatomy of professional envy. It is a cognitive distortion that transforms the talent of others into an existential threat. The initial admiration rots into a constant suspicion that clouds the monarch's judgment. From now on, his priority is not to govern, but to neutralize the person he perceives as his replacement. Saul's insecurity turns David's merit into a personal affront. This dynamic is common in hierarchies where the leader fears being surpassed. Instead of leveraging his team's potential, the insecure leader spends his energy protecting a throne that feels increasingly unstable. The moment in which the women sang that Saul struck down his 10,000, marked a point of no return. For a leader whose worth depends on external metrics, this comparison was not a simple chant, but a deep wound. This is where the brain processes social comparison as a direct threat to the integrity of the individual. From neuroscience, we know that losing status before a group activates the same brain areas as physical pain. Saul's amygdala detected an imminent danger in the face of David's superior success. By focusing on these relative numbers, his psychological stability ceased to be based on his own achievements and became chained to the performance of his rival. This dependence on external value metrics destroys private integrity. When you constantly measure yourself against the success of others, your identity fragments and you lose your emotional center. Saul no longer saw his purpose as a ruler, but rather his position as a disadvantaged figure before the people. Thus, internal reality crumbles, and paranoia emerges as a desperate attempt to regain lost control. The account describes an evil spirit that began to torment Saul. From an analytical perspective, this represents the collapse of emotional regulation and the entry into clinical paranoia. When stress becomes chronic, your prefrontal cortex loses its ability to curb aggressive reactions. This is the part of the brain responsible for judgment and impulse control. Imagine the scene. David plays the harp to calm the king, but Saul responds by throwing a spear. This disconnection is total. The leader no longer distinguishes between an ally who seeks his well-being and an imaginary enemy. In this state of high alert, the nervous system is flooded with cortisol. This keeps the individual in a permanent fight or flight mode. This physiological exhaustion has a devastating cost. Professional boundaries break down and violence becomes a desperate management tool. Saul is not just trying to eliminate David, he is trying to silence the internal noise of his own insecurity. What was once a doubt has been transformed into a pathology that destroys his ability to govern with justice. The definitive break with Samuel was not just a political conflict, but the collapse of Saul's last emotional bridge. When you lose a mentor, you also lose the mirror that reflects an honest image of your actions. Without this external moral compass, the monarch entered a vacuum of responsibility where his impulses no longer found restraint. This professional isolation is the final destination of paranoia. By suspecting everyone, the leader ends up pushing away those who could help him most, creating a vicious cycle of loneliness. In psychology, this is known as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Your fear of being betrayed leads you to act so erratically that the abandonment of others becomes inevitable. Now, without legitimate guides and surrounded by silences, decision-making ceases to be strategic. It becomes purely instinctive and dark. What happens when logic fails and power is left alone? In his desperation, Saul began to seek validation in forbidden sources, definitively moving away from reality. This Loneliness at the top is the clearest symptom of a leadership that has lost its purpose. On the eve of his final battle, Saul finds himself in an absolute void. Faced with the silence of his usual sources of guidance, the monarch crosses a line that he himself firmly drew. His visit to the Witch of Endor is not just an act of desperation. It is what we call a reverential collapse. This phenomenon occurs when a leader, cornered by uncertainty, betrays his fundamental values to try to regain control over an uncertain future. By disguising himself to consult a medium, Saul abandons his identity. The man who persecuted sorcery now kneels before it, seeking answers in the forbidden. In psychology, this represents the death of the ego before physical death. When you stop believing in your own principles, your internal structure disintegrates. This is the final symptom of paranoia, the loss of integrity. Saul no longer tries to save his people, but rather to alleviate his own anguish. By breaking his ethical code, he confirms that his royal authority has disappeared. In this state of disintegration, the leader ceases to be the architect of his destiny, to become a shadow walking toward his own end. Saul's collapse is not a story stuck in the past, but a current warning for today's professional and social environment. Many current leaders suffer from this complex when the success of a collaborator is perceived as a personal attack. To avoid this fall, it is essential to integrate our shadow. This psychological concept refers to recognizing those insecurities and fears that, if they remain hidden, end up governing our decisions in a destructive way. Emotional regulation begins by understanding that the talent of others does not diminish your position, but rather strengthens it. Instead of reacting with suspicion toward the brilliance of a team, the resilient leader cultivates self-awareness to curb paranoiac impulses. This involves shifting the focus from external metrics of validation, such as status or applause, toward a personal competence based on purpose. The true defense against the Saul Complex is private integrity. When your identity does not depend exclusively on public recognition, you stop being a prisoner of constant comparison. The most enduring leadership is not that which protects its position with aggressiveness, but that which builds its legacy from internal security and generosity toward the success of others. Mastering your shadows is the first step toward real leadership. Saul taught us that power without inner peace is a prison. Thank you for joining us in this deep analysis of the insecure leader archetype. If you are interested in understanding the psychology behind the great figures of history, subscribe now to the Archetype Project. Your support allows us to continue exploring the mysteries of the human mind. We will see you soon to discover new mirrors of our own reality. See you soon. Media out.